Hello, in this video I'll show you how to make a light display shadow box based on wedding photos. The first step to creating a light display shadow box is to think about how you want your overall box to look. Because it's a shadow box, we need to have multiple layers to reflect depth and to have those shadows show between the layers. This is the reference picture I was using that I wanted to mock my shadow box off of. You can see the depth in this picture because there was actual depth in real life. But when I'm using plain white paper to recreate the depth, I have to think about how my layers will interact with each other. Looking at this wedding scene, I know I want the arch to be the very back of the background, and I like the lamps, so I'll include those next to the arch. Then there's the large barrel with the flowers on top and the smaller barrel with the candle on top. I'm going to use that as my next layer. This will be the second farthest from the light source. My focal point is going to be the bride and groom kissing. And then the very front layer, I'm actually thinking of putting a border on that will be the lace from the bride's dress. I'll show you how I go about doing this by editing the photos from the wedding on my laptop and then loading these into the Cricut Design Space. This photo provides a good reference overall of how I want the light display shadow box to look. However, with the people in the photo, it's difficult to see some of the elements. So I'm actually going to open up multiple different photos to take the pieces that I want out of those photos and create the image as a whole again in the Cricut Design Space. In this photo, I'm trying to isolate the small barrel with the candle on top. I'm using my select tool to delete all of the background except for that barrel with the candle on top. For pieces with smaller or more intricate details, I might have to switch to the eraser, but this selection tool allows me to get most of the background. On the Mac, you can use the combination of Command and Shift to add to your selection, and the combination of Command and Alt to delete from your selection. It's useful to highlight a few areas at a time, and then use the Alt or Shift key in combination with the Command key as needed to make sure that you're not deleting too many pieces. As you can see in this clip, I'm getting right up next to the edge of the barrel. If you're using photos where it's difficult to distinguish between the edge of the piece that you want to keep and the other background of the photo, you can also change your colors or your contrast to make that edge stand out more. But this photo had a pretty good edge and it was picking up the barrel nicely, so I didn't need to do that. Once I have the pieces selected that I need, I just press the delete key and it deletes the background of the image. Thinking about the fact that we're going to be cutting these images as well, we also have to take into consideration any thin areas or corners that are too sharp for the Cricut machine to cut. When I get to areas like that, or areas that just need additional material added in, I like to use the paintbrush and just paint on what I need. We'll be loading this as a PNG file into the Cricut Design Space and using it as a cut image. The PNG file and the cut image in Cricut Design Space don't take into account the different colors. It will export everything to look like the same color. So it ultimately doesn't matter if you cut a few pieces out or need to add some pieces in if you just use a paintbrush, regardless of what color you're using, because when we export this as a PNG file, it'll all overlay to be the same color in Cricut Design Space. I prefer to use Pixelmator as my photo editing tool. It's not very expensive compared to other tools like Photoshop, and I don't do a lot of photo editing, so it has all the capacity and capability for what I use it for. However, if you have a different design tool, that would work fine. The key to this is just deleting out the background, so it wouldn't take a very complex tool to do this. Once your image is edited to the amount that you would like, export, and make sure you export as a PNG. If you export this as a JPEG photo, it will keep the different layers and won't load correctly into the Cricut Design Space. Then open your Cricut Design Space and add this as an image. Use Upload Images under the Upload function and choose what you just edited. I always choose Simple if I'm doing just a cut image because it'll help it load faster. And then you can double check if you have any areas that the background didn't fully erase here, and then click Continue once your piece looks right. Here you can see that the cut image transfers all as one color, so it doesn't matter what colors we have in the photo that we're uploading because it'll look the same in Cricut Design Space. After I had loaded this barrel with the candle into the Cricut Design Space, I actually noticed that I didn't like the shape of the bottom right of the barrel, so I went back into my Pixelmator editor and I painted on the bottom half of the barrel again until it was to the dimensions that I liked. Then I reloaded this into the Cricut Design Space. The next detail I wanted to add to the light display shadow box was the lamps on each side of the altar. The best photos I had of this was a photo straight on, and I think the candles look nice, but I didn't like how the wood and the background faced into it. So here I'm actually selecting the pieces of the lantern and the candle and moving this to a new layer. I'm doing the Command Shift key to highlight the pieces I'm looking for, and then I'll do Command C to copy this as a new layer in Pixelmator. And then once I have it copied over, I just took a paintbrush and filled it in black so that I could see the area I was working with. Then I deleted the rest of the background and then recreated the lamppost to be the shape and direction that I wanted. I used the right-hand bracket on the keyboard to make the paintbrush bigger, and I used the left-hand bracket to make the paintbrush smaller. These brackets also work to make the selection tool bigger or smaller. When I'm painting this layer, I don't have to try to stay within the lines because of the layer edges having already been selected. As you can see, the paintbrush will only paint what's within this layer. Once the layer is fully filled in, then I press Command D to deselect the layer. Now that I have the piece of the lantern that I want, I delete the rest of the background. I decided to clean up the handle of the lantern, so I used my eraser tool just to cut these pieces out. Then I'm using the paintbrush just to clean up the edges of the candle. I see where some of those gaps are, and I know that the Cricut machine won't be able to cut those edges. Thinking about the lamp as being in the back layer of this light display shadow box, I want the light to shine through the candle, which is why I didn't want the wood to be directly behind it. So I'm actually going to take a rectangle and move it to the right-hand side, and then I'm going to freehand draw the hook to connect this lantern to the wood post. These are really thin lines already, and I know it's going to be difficult for the Cricut to handle cutting these lines out. So I'm actually going to take the paintbrush and paint over each of these lines to thicken them until it's an amount that the Cricut will be able to handle. This might be trial and error, and I did actually have to cut this twice to get the lines thick enough that they actually stayed together. Once I had the lantern and the post in the shape that I wanted, I exported this into a PNG file and then uploaded it to the Cricut Design Space. Then I used the same process to edit the large barrel with the flowers on top and to edit the background arch. To piece together the forwardmost layer in the light display shadow box, I'm using the lace from the bride's dress. I'm referencing this photo where there's a section of lace that's pretty long and stands out well enough from the dress that I can actually pick out the pieces and delete the background around it. So here I'm taking out as much background as possible with the selection tool, and then I'll go in with the eraser and make the detailed erases in and out of the lace where the color is just too close for the selection tool to pick up the differences. This edit is by far the one that took me the longest because of so many intricate details, but once I had this piece complete, then I was able to load it into the Cricut Design Space and copy and paste and move it around to create the entire border. It was definitely worth the work it took. I forgot to film making the lace border, so I'll explain here what I did. Once I had this piece loaded into the Cricut Design Space, I copy and pasted so I had a few duplicates and then was able to size this to the size that I wanted that fit within the box square. I didn't want any of the pieces to seem duplicated in the final product, so I used the left and right sides of the lace on the left and right sides of the box so that there wasn't duplication anywhere. I also did the same thing for the top and bottom of the border. I rotated the whole piece of lace 90 degrees so that it would align to the top and bottom of the box. And then I laid the lace so that it wouldn't look like duplications or repeats between the top and bottom borders. Once I had everything laid out in the way that I liked, I used the weld tool to attach and combine the lace to the background. Once I have all the elements for the light display shadow box loaded into Cricut Design Space, I insert the images into my workbook. These images likely started as much bigger sizing because of the photos that we were editing, so I'll have to shrink them down to size. I also insert the standard template I have for my light display shadow boxes. This is a box packet. It's just the very top sheet and the bottom sheet that has a score line that allows the different layers to be spaced out while still holding everything together and giving a nice clean finish to the box. I load this in here so that I can check the sizing on the elements that I've added in to ensure that I have them small or large enough. Check out my video linked below to see how to make your own box template. I edited the barrels from the left and the right that had the flowers on top because the flowers came out pretty unique looking, and I didn't want to copy and paste to have two barrels just flipped. However, I did want to have a consistent look on the lamp with the lantern and on the small barrel with the candle. So I only edited one of those each in the Pixelmator editor. And then after I've loaded it into my Cricut Design Space page, I'll just copy and flip it horizontally. I also make sure to save the project so I don't lose any of the work we've done so far. Because the bride and groom are going to be the focal point, I actually created another layer of just the bride and just the groom. I'm going to cut these out separately and then glue these on after I've cut each of these layers on the Cricut design. This is going to create a really cool effect of light with a thin layer of light between the bride and the groom. And it will also make them stand out more in the light display shadow box. As mentioned earlier, I'm using 4 different layers to create this shadow box. The very back layer is going to have the arch with the 2 lanterns. The layer in front of that will have the large barrels with the flowers on top and the small barrels with the candle. The layer in front of that will have the bride and groom. And then the forwardmost layer will be the border layer that has the depiction of the bride's dress lace around the edges. I'm taking each of the layers from the shadow box template I have loaded, making sure that the layer with the thickest border is at the back and the thinnest border is at the front. And I'm overlaying each of the elements that I've loaded into the Cricut Design Space onto each of those layers in the same order that I mentioned earlier. I overlay the layers on top of each other to make sure that everything is spacing out correctly and nothing is blocking something behind it. And then I use the weld tool to attach the different elements to the template layer. A key piece to including all of these design elements is that you have to have something connecting each of these together. I used an oval shape to reflect the flooring and welded the oval shape in with each of these features. So every layer will be welded together to form one cohesive layer that will cut in a smooth line on the actual Cricut machine. When making edits, it's really important to frequently overlay all 4 layers on top of each other just to make sure that nothing in a forward layer is blocking something in a layer behind it, and also to make sure that your centering is aligned. To do this, you can just highlight all of the boxes that are selected and click the Align button up at the top, and you can center horizontally, and you can center vertically. It's also very important to size this overall box to the size of the shadow box that you have purchased. You want to make sure that this entire piece will fit within your shadow box, and you don't want it to be too tight of a fit, otherwise you can bend the paper as it's sitting in the shadow box. Finally, once you have each of your layers edited and sized to the necessary size of your shadow box, it's time to cut these out. I'm using 65-pound cardstock. I have my material set to 80-pound on my Cricut, and I also have the knob on the Cricut itself turned to cardstock. I place one piece of paper onto my Cricut mat, and then the Cricut Design Space walks me through loading the material and starting the cut. I have a second mat that I use, and I have pre-loaded with paper, so as soon as this one is done cutting, I'll take it out, I'll replace it with my second mat, and while that piece is cutting, I'll peel off the piece that was just finished cutting. This saves me time. It's really beneficial to use two mats to do this, especially when I have longer cuts like these. While the paper is cutting, I also like to prepare some foam strips. This is just some foam board that I got from Hobby Lobby, and it's really useful to separate the different layers of paper. This is what's going to create the depth in the shadow box and what will allow the actual shadow to shine between layers. I'm cutting the foam strips about 1/4 inch in width, and I cut these all the way through on a cutting mat with an X-Acto knife. I like to use 4 pieces per piece of paper, so however many layers you're using, just make sure you have enough of the foam strips. The foam board that I'm using has a sticky backing. This will be really useful when we are gluing down the different layers, and I'll show you what I mean by that later on. We want to be really careful with how we're removing the cut paper from the sticky mats. Because the mats are so sticky, the paper can actually bend, and we don't want bent paper that wouldn't look very good in the light display shadow box. So my preferred method to remove paper without bending it is to actually bend the sticky mat. I like to do this over the edge of my work table. The sticky mat will recover much better than the paper would. It's hard to get any of those creases out. So I find this is the best way to keep the paper flat. For the small intricate details on the paper that the Cricut machine has cut out, I like to use the X-Acto knife just to remove any of those stubborn pieces that don't want to come off. Especially if this is on thin pieces of paper that are likely to bend, it really helps to push this down and pull it out the bottom of the piece of paper rather than trying to cut it out or yank it off of a sticky mat. You do want to be really careful while working on this. Of course, if you mess a piece of paper up, you can always cut that layer again, but it does save time to try and get it done the right way the first time. This piece will be the base of the paper box that we will put all the layers into before placing the whole package into the shadow box. So here I'm folding along the scored lines, and then I will hot glue each of the extra corner tabs over the edges. Similar to the bottom of the paper box, for the top piece of the paper box, I fold along the scored edges, and again I'm going to hot glue the corner tabs. This paper box isn't essential to having a good looking light display shadow box, but I think it's a really important step, and it helps to cover up any edges that might be rough or any of the foam pieces that might be showing through the layers. I think it also provides a nice visual impact on the very front of the box, and I think you'll see what I mean by that when we put the whole thing together. Once you have the corners glued down for both the top and bottom pieces of the paper box, then you can put the top piece of the box over the bottom piece. The top should be bigger than the bottom, and it should fit snugly but not too tight that causes the paper to bend. Here I have the layer of the bride and groom kissing at the altar, and I also have the individual pieces of the bride and the groom cut out that I'm going to glue on top. As a reminder, I did size down the bride and groom just slightly on the individual pieces so that there will be a little halo effect of those pieces when the light is on and shining behind them. I use just a little bit of hot glue here, and I'm very careful not to get it on any of the edges because nothing will be in front of this piece. You definitely don't want any hot glue to show through. Here I'm just double checking that the layer for the bride and groom kissing looks nice and seeing how that halo effect looks when I'm holding it up to a light source. It's finally time to start combining the layers for the shadow box. I start with the back layer first just to make sure that I'm building up visually in the same direction that I would be looking at the shadow box once it's completed. This also helps me make sure that I'm not skipping any layers. So first I remove the sticky backing from each of the foam strips, and then I put some hot glue down on the strip and glue it to the edge of the piece of paper, and I'm trying to get this as close to the edge as possible without having it hang over the edge. I place 3 of the foam strips down with hot glue, and then for the 4th foam strip I'm actually going to do this one upside down. So I'm going to leave the sticky backing on, and I hot glue the foam strip down with the sticky backing facing up. Then once that's well secured, I'll take the piece of paper off that's protecting that sticky back, and I size up my next layer to go on top of this. The stickiness on the back of this piece of foam isn't strong enough to hold all of the layers together, which is why I'm using the hot glue, but it is strong enough for me to place the sheet of paper on top, and it allows me the flexibility to adjust the piece of paper as needed without having to tear up any hot glue. I find this is a really good trick in adjusting the sequential layers of the shadow box to make sure that they all line up without having to rush it in the amount of time that hot glue would dry. Then once I have everything lined up, I just gently press that next piece of paper onto the sticky backing, and I work my way around the other 3 foam strips by hot gluing them down. Finally, once I have those 3 down, I will lift the paper gently off of the foam strip with the sticky backing, and I'll put a new line of hot glue on that one. This makes sure that each layer is firmly secured to the foam strips and to the layer behind it, while still giving me that flexibility to adjust it until I have it fully glued down. I've tried making shadow boxes before where I only put the foam strips down on 2 of the edges, or where I only put it down just in the middle of the edge, and I find that that makes the paper bow, especially when you add more and more layers, and it just doesn't look as clean as a final product. But even though it takes more time, it really is worth cutting each of these foam strips individually and gluing them down individually. It just makes the final product look so much nicer. I continue using the same process to attach all the pieces of paper with the different foam strips until all of the layers are attached. So finally I have all the layers glued together. Here you can see what it looks like, and I hold this up to a light source just to double check that nothing is blocking anything that's behind it, and that everything fits together nicely. Once I'm sure that everything looks good, then I will put this into the paper box that we created. I put it into the back of the box first, and then take the top piece and slide it on top. As you can see, everything just packages together nicely, and it's really hard to see any of those foam strips now. Once we have our cut paper in the shadow box, it's going to be pretty difficult to take it out. So I'm taking a piece of tape and picking up any lint or pieces of dust that might have fallen onto that glass surface, just to make sure that I'm not leaving anything between the glass and the paper image. If you have any smudges on the box, you could also use glasses cleaner and a lint-free rag here to clean the box as well. Once the inside of the glass is clean, you can push the cut paper shadow box into the actual shadow box display. It should fit snug, but it shouldn't be so tight that any of your paper starts to bow on the front. And here you can see the completed product. Now I'm taking a strip of LED lights and attaching that inside the shadow box. I got these from Lowe's, and I will link them in the description below. This strip light is really nice because it also has a sticky backing. I take the lights completely off of the packaging and then peel the sticky backing off. I put the first layer up against the very edge of the shadow box. Keep in mind how the lights are going to connect to the power source. So this is the edge that connects to the power cord, so I'm making sure to keep that at the bottom center of the box to allow room for the plug-in. Then I press these all the way around the edge of the shadow box. I've connected the power source cord here just to double check that I have enough room for it. I like to do a second layer of the lights just to make the overall box look brighter, but I found that it never works if I make the lights cross across the back of the paper, because the individual lights will actually show through well enough and it distorts how the view looks on the front. So I take the lights and I actually twist them around. It's a natural twist for the lights because of how they were spooled up in the packaging. I just twist the edge and then tape it down to the back of the shadow box, and I make one complete layer with the lights facing inwards. And I try to keep the lights as close to the edge as possible because this is where we have multiple layers of paper and you won't be able to see the individual lights through all that paper. However, it will make the overall box look brighter. Once I have all the lights in and taped down, I cut the LED strip and get rid of the extra. You want to be careful where you're cutting the LED strip. As I show here, this is where you're supposed to cut. You don't want to cut through any of the connections or it could short the entire circuit and your LEDs might not work. Finally, I'm going to reconnect the power cord and tape this in place as well. Once that's secure, I'll take the back of the shadow box and push that into place. Because the cord comes out the bottom corner of the shadow box, you can see here that I took my X-Acto knife and I cut a little slot out of that bottom right corner of the backing to make sure there's enough room for the power cord to come out. You should still have enough space within your shadow box to be able to secure the back to the shadow box. Now that your shadow box is fully assembled, plug it in and test it out. One reason I really like these LED strip lights is because they can change color. They also don't heat, so they're safe to have around all the paper in the shadow box. Thanks for watching this video on how to make a light display shadow box. Let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.